Today, the man who brought us the news for so many years was the news. Huw Edwards, surrounded by police, entered Westminster Magistrates Court, accused of accessing images of child abuse. As the counts of making indecent images of children were put to him, Mr. Edwards said calmly, guilty. He's admitted having dozens of images of children on his WhatsApp sent to him by another man. 7 were of the worst kind, category A, and 2 were videos of a child aged around 7 to 9 years old. In all, there were 41 images of children sent, the prosecutor said, with the former broadcaster's approval. At one point, the man sending them asked if the pictures were too young. Mr. Edwards told him not to send any illegal images. His defence barrister said Huw Edwards didn't create or share any of the pictures or videos, but under the law, making indecent images can mean opening them on social media or email.
Every picture, every video is a crime scene. It's a child being violated, terrorised.
Chris Tuck is a survivor of child sexual abuse. She was an advisor to the independent inquiry into childhood abuse.
The fact that we are seeing a well-known figure pleading guilty to these offences just really shows society that a sexual offender is not the man in the raincoat, and it's not stranger danger. It's people that we truly trust, like, who we invite into our homes through the TV or through our computer screen or through our phones.
The fact that someone formerly so trusted, so respected, has admitted looking at indecent images of children, does that give victims potentially confidence to come forward?
What it will do is add more volume to the conversation around child sexual abuse and exploitation, and its impact on the actual victim and survivors. And the impact is huge. It's often for a lifetime.
Tonight at 10,
Huw Edwards was the BBC's highest paid newsreader, fronting first the 6 o'clock news and then the news at 10. He was trusted to lead the corporation's coverage of royal and state occasions and the big moments in the nation's history.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
But Huw Edwards hasn't been on our screens for a year, following reports in the Sun newspaper claiming he'd paid a young person for explicit images. The Metropolitan Police said there was no evidence of criminal behaviour in relation to those allegations. Just a few months later, the police were at Huw Edwards' door over a separate investigation into child abuse images. He was arrested in November, something the police only made public on Monday. But today, in a statement, the BBC revealed it knew about Huw Edwards' arrest at the time, saying, "In November 2023, whilst Mr. Edwards was suspended, the BBC, as his employer at the time, was made aware in confidence that he had been arrested on suspicion of serious offences and released on bail while the police continued their investigation. At the time, no charges had been brought against Mr. Edwards, and the BBC had also been made aware of significant risk to his health. If at any point during the period Mr. Edwards was employed by the BBC he had been charged, the BBC had determined it would act immediately to dismiss him." The BBC is facing questions about why Huw Edwards, having been suspended, remained on a full salary and had a £40,000 pay rise. He resigned on medical advice 3 months ago. Huw Edwards was released on conditional bail. He'll be sentenced in September and could go to jail, although sentencing guidelines also say a community order can be an alternative to prison, where there's sufficient prospect of rehabilitation. But Huw Edwards' reputation can hardly be repaired.
And Jane is with me now. Just explain, why were the police investigating Huw Edwards?
Well, we wondered that. Why a new investigation, given that the Met had stressed that today's court case was entirely unrelated to the claims that they'd looked into last summer, first reported in the Sun newspaper. And they sent us a statement which did fill in some of the blanks. What happened was they were contacted by detectives from South Wales Police who'd been investigating a 25-year-old Welsh man called Alex Williams for sexual offences. They had seized this man's phone and found a WhatsApp chat full of pornographic images of children. And they found Huw Edwards had participated in that WhatsApp chat. Alex Williams actually pleaded guilty 4 months ago to possessing and distributing indecent images. He got a 12-month suspended sentence. So he is the man who sent the images that Huw Edwards today admitted to accessing.
Jane, thank you very much. Well, joining me now is Rosamond Irwin, who's media editor at the Sunday Times. What do you think the questions are that aren't answered yet?
Well, there are a lot of questions for the BBC, not least that they knew he was arrested in November, and yet they continued not only to employ him, but to keep paying him as their best paid journalist, their best paid newsreader, which will be very surprising to people. They've said that they had known he had been charged, and obviously the charge happened after he left the BBC, so they weren't made aware of him being charged. But they said if he'd been charged, then they would have dismissed him. But it's not clear why that would make a difference, given that if they were not dismissing him because they were thinking innocent until proven guilty, a charge wouldn't have taken them over that line either. So it's unclear why they decided that they would wait until he was charged to do that. And obviously, they have paid him very handsomely in a time in which he wasn't working, a time at which, of course, also they're making other journalists redundant. And so the idea that he was getting an incredibly generous salary, not working, and on top of that, had actually been arrested and they were aware of that, will be very shocking to people.
Well,
and I suppose
just on that, I mean, I suppose that, you know, the point of a charge means that it has crossed a certain threshold. It's been examined by prosecutors and they believe there's enough evidence and it's in the public interest to prosecute. At the point of arrest, I mean, it could be anything, couldn't it? I mean, but are you really saying the BBC should have sacked him just on the point of arrest?
Well, I think some people will certainly be arguing that. I mean, you've got to remember there were other complaints about his behaviour as well. Obviously, they may not have passed a criminal bar. They clearly didn't, so the police had ruled. But of course, we are all sacked for things that if we act unprofessionally. You don't have to pass a criminal bar. All of us in our contracts, if we're on staff at news organisations, we'll have a line about not bringing an organisation into disrepute. And you could have argued that Huw Edwards had already done that. So it isn't that you need to wait until there's a criminal allegation anyway. And a lot of the defenders of Huw Edwards originally were pointing out that it wasn't clear originally, and obviously the police then decided that he hadn't committed a criminal act in relation to the young person who the Sun reported that he'd received explicit images for. But of course, you might still, without crossing a criminal bar, there have been dragging an organisation into disrepute. And certainly there were other allegations to do with colleagues where they'd been made to feel uncomfortable. There was a body of evidence. And actually, I revealed in April on the Sunday Times that they'd actually had complaints about Huw Edwards 2 years earlier. The complaint had been withdrawn. But they had warned Huw Edwards twice about his misuse of social media and reminded them the BBC has very stringent guidelines about how staff behave on social media, understandably, particularly people who are journalists. And so they could have been aware there were an awful lot of problems already. So the idea that they had to wait, it will certainly seem odd to people. It's
and
not
just
for
briefly,
me.
what about the question of whether anybody should have been informed after the BBC knew? You know, the BBC has a duty to tell people the news, but also has a duty of care and can't treat people as guilty until proven so. So were they right to sit on this information?
Well, I would argue not. But of course, this isn't about BBC editorial. They do have, a line between the editorial and the corporate thing. So editorial wasn't aware. And there are certainly BBC journalists who think they should have been made aware of this. But I think it is very problematic for the BBC that they have someone, they're aware it's a serious allegation. Obviously, they said they weren't aware of quite the nature of them. That would have been the case. But they were aware of this complaint. They continued to pay him. And then they let him leave on his own terms. So he claimed medical grounds in April. I looked over the statement that they put out, the sort of 55-word statement they put out when he left. And it was very clear it was his decision. It wasn't theirs.
Ros Irwin, thank you very much indeed for joining us.